and welcome to Margaret Media. I am Biniam Ambachew, and I'm your host for Margaret English. Today, I have Robel Alemu. He's the Director of Communications for the Amhara Association of America, also known as AAA. Robel, welcome to Margaret Media, and it's good to be with you.
Thank you, Biniam. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and it's always a pleasure to be a guest on Margaret.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us again, Robel. Please stay with us and join the discussion, and we will return after a short break. Going on to the first question, Robert, can you explain who organized the Ethiopian Diaspora Peace Conference and how the Amhara community was able to participate in this event?
Thank you, Biniam, for that question. I can certainly go into that. And in short, the Ethiopian Diaspora Peace Conference was co-organized by the Horn of Africa Community Organization and the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego. So this was San Diego, California, between Friday, July 21st, which was when the public conference was held, and then on Saturday, the 22nd, during which there was a private meeting attended by government officials and the diaspora representatives. The keynote speakers for the public event were Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, who is ranking member of the African Subcommittee, and the U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, Ambassador Mike Hammer. And so the final speaker list actually included myself and 4 other diaspora representatives from the Somali or Ogaden community, the Oromo community, as well as the Tigrayan community. But it's important to say that the Amhara representation actually wasn't there until very shortly after shortly before the event was to take place. In fact, AAA received an invitation about 3 days before the event took place. It was announced as early as July 12th, and then the invitation we received on July the 18th. The stated intention of the conference was to bring together these diaspora community leaders, and then as well as other stakeholders such as elected officials, U.S. government diplomats, congressional staffers, academics, and advocates to chart a way forward and to discuss peace in Ethiopia.
Thank you, Robel, for providing that wonderful introduction and giving us an overview about the organizers and what transpired during the conference. Going on to the second question, Robert, what are some of the proposed recommendations that the Amhara representatives presented at the public conference and in the private meetings? Can you also explain what led the Amhara representatives to walk out of the private meeting?
Thank you, Biniam, for this question, or for these questions. I think these are very critical points to go over. And it's true, the Amhara representatives were actually forced to walk out of the private meeting that was held on Saturday. And maybe I can just start with providing an overview of what points were discussed from our perspective. Okay, so there was overlap between the points that were covered in the discussions held in the public event on the Friday and then the private event on the on the Saturday. So I'm going to focus on what points were raised during the private meeting. But for example, the speech that I made during the public event is made available on our social media. So you can go to AAA's Twitter page, Facebook, YouTube, and access that. But in terms of points that were raised for the private meeting, there was one, we were very bold with these points, by the way. So we were very relevant to what was happening in Ethiopia right now. And we felt these were points that were critical to make this conference worthwhile and to promote peace. Okay. So first and foremost, the removal of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his Prosperity Party. Okay. And I think this was considered as a very bold point and received in that way by our compatriots. And I think it was also important for us to offer an alternative or some type of a choice. And that's why we also talked about a civilian-led transitional government. Okay, so this is a very, I think, sensible solution to the problem that we've seen in Ethiopia over the past 5 years since Prime Minister Abiy and his party took over. And another key point was the withdrawal of non-Amhara forces from the Amhara region. And so this has implications for the ongoing war by the Abiy regime against the Amhara people, as well as ongoing invasions by multiple armed groups, including the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, including the Oromo Liberation Army, the OLA, and others. Okay. And then there was the issue of political prisoners. So we wanted to call for the release of all political prisoners, all Amhara political prisoners, including journalists, opposition figures, academics, professors, students, office workers, humanitarians, you name it. There were many prominent names that were actually detained arbitrarily throughout the Amhara region, throughout Oromia region, throughout Addis Ababa, and elsewhere in the country. And these people have been rounded up in detention sites. And we wanted to make sure this issue, which is very important, was brought to the attention of the attendees in the meeting and to the U.S. policymakers. And then in tying with all of this, there was also a very critical point made about the admission that the peace deal, the Pretoria deal, or the cessation of hostilities agreement, that it was a failure because it did not bring lasting peace to Ethiopia. In fact, we argued, especially in the public event, about how since the implementation of this deal, there was actually an increase in ethnic and religious-based violence undertaken primarily by the Abiy regime. And so I talked about the ongoing war on Amharas. We've seen mass atrocities being committed by Abiy Ahmed's regime forces, the Oromo-dominated ENDF under Field Marshal Birhanu Jula, and the likes of military officials such as Ababaw Taddese. And we're talking about massacres, civilian massacres, okay, very reminiscent of what we saw during the war in northern Ethiopia. And as early as a few days ago, for example, we saw what happened in central Gondar. For example, there was a massacre of civilians in Gorgora. There was also a massacre of civilians many weeks ago in Debre Elias by one of the areas that was being used for a local monastery. So this is a heritage site, an ancient religious heritage site that was desecrated by soldiers that went in and shot and killed an estimated hundreds of worshippers, monks, orphans, and other civilians. Okay? And in addition to the killings, we have rape, looting, property destruction, and other atrocities. So this is a war that's being imposed onto the Amhara people. This has been going on since May 2023. And we wanted to emphasize that this was a very important issue and that the peace deal did not account for this and that this happened afterwards, okay? After that, ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing throughout Oromia region, throughout Shegger. These are the outskirts of Addis Ababa, include suburbs that were actually forcibly incorporated by the Oromia Regional Administration under Oromia Regional President Shimallis Abdiisa in collusion with Addis Ababa's Deputy Mayor Adanech Abebe. And we talked about the forced demolitions of homes and evictions that have been taking place against non-Oromos, primarily ethnic Amharas that have been displaced to areas such as Debre Birhan in Amhara region, places like the elsewhere in Addis Ababa, as well as other places, for example, in the southern region, such as in places like Arba Minch. Okay, and we have attacks on the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church against the Muslim worshippers, and these were government forces that shot at worshippers, that arrested influencers, okay, that arrested religious leaders, and there was even demolitions of mosques in the capital city. And then we also raised the ongoing TPLF occupation of Amhara territories. So these are areas in northern Amhara that are in close proximity to the Tigray region, including in areas such as Telemt, as well as in Wag. So in these areas, there is ongoing occupation of Amhara territories by TPLF forces, which have not disarmed as per the Pretoria Agreement, okay? And then accountability. Accountability was a very important issue, and we emphasized the need for accountability predating November 2020. November 2020 was when the war in northern Ethiopia started, with the TPLF attacking the ENDF Northern Command, and then proceeding to try to invade Amhara region, and then a few days after, massacring over 1,600 civilians in Mai Kadra. Mai Kadra being a small town located in the Welkait Agade Seti Humera zone in northern Amhara. okay? And then we talked about the need for penalties for the 30 plus years of crimes by the EPRDF. So when we talk about before November 2020, we're talking about the Amhara genocide that predated the war in northern Ethiopia. And this is by the TPLF, this implicates the Oromia regional government, the Amhara regional government, the Southern regional government, and so on and so forth. And so we also called for targeted sanctions against the government officials and military leaders complicit in Amhara genocide. And of course, we also cited the other genocides that were committed by the EPRDF, and particularly by the TPLF, including the genocide against the Anuak in Gambela, the genocide against the Somalian Ogaden, the genocide against even the other communities elsewhere in the country, okay? And then we talked about restoration of telecommunications and internet services in Amhara region. Again, this is connected to the war in Amhara region that's ongoing since May 2023. And then resettlement of IDPs displaced from Oromia region. Okay, the United Nations has reported that over 1 million Amharas have been displaced from Western Oromia region. Okay, our civilians were displaced from Western Oromia region, and this is as a result of ethnic conflict, violence, and the genocide against Amhara civilians. And lastly, we brought up constitutional reform, as we believe that the Constitution is one of the primary sources for a lot of the institutionalized targeting and marginalization of Amharas. So this was a process that was not inclusive of Amharas. The Constitution was imposed in the 1990s by the TPLF and their partners, such as the Oromo Liberation Front. And this was done to, for example, annex ancestral Amhara lands such as Wilkait, Agadet, Alamt, Satitumara, and Raya. Okay, and then there's also implications for territories such as Metakel, Dara, and even the capital city. And then when we talk about this private meeting, overall, we can say that our assessment as the Amhara representatives was that it was disorganized. It had procedural issues. So there was no agreed upon process beforehand that was made clear to us. And when I talk about us, I was actually joined by several prominent members of the Amhara community in the San Diego area, in the California area. And so these were doctors, professors who were very intelligent, very articulate, that were able to join me in this private meeting representing Amharas. However, they themselves actually, our team rather, was not given proportionally similar allotment of time by the moderators compared to other groups. So our team members would be, cut off. They wouldn't be allowed to finish their thoughts. There was lots of interruptions. It's also important to note that the note taker in this process was self-appointed from the representatives. He was a member of the Somali community. His name is Faisal Roble. And this in itself, is something that was problematic, given that this means the note taker, which is a very important role in such a process, is not someone that's independent of some of the discussions that are being had. And so the point of this was for us rather, to agree on consensus items. And there was a sense of pressure. There was a sense of pressure from the moderators. There was a sense of pressure from later the special envoy, who wasn't there the whole time, but joined later on. And so when it came time for this, pressure to agree on consensus items after everyone kind of went through a round of sharing their thoughts, we requested time for deliberation, which was met with opposition, but later was allotted to us. And so after this break, we came back and we communicated our concerns and our overall apprehensiveness to agree to this set of consensus items, because we noted that there were red line issues that were omitted. Okay, so for example, earlier I talked about the removal of Prime Minister Abiy, admission of the failure of the Pretoria peace deal, constitutional amendment, and these were issues that did not appear on the final list of consensus items, and they were omitted by the note taker. And really, especially the first two, the removal of Prime Minister Abiy and his party, and the admission of the failure of the Pretoria peace deal, these were issues that actually the other groups in their brainstorming and when they were presenting ideas appeared to align with their ideas. However, later it became clear that they did not want these items to be included in the final consensus. So this was an interesting observation that we had. And there was also items that were inserted into the final resolution that were not discussed by other representatives, but rather imposed by the note taker. And one of these items, for example, was a day of atonement for crimes against Tigray. Okay, I'm paraphrasing, but the idea here is that this was a process where when we would present the crimes that have taken place against Amharas, there was this tendency to, I would say, dilute those points and talk about the need to recognize suffering by everyone. Okay, so there's kind of this, both sidesism that was going on, except now when the case was for other groups spotlighting their own grievances, that pressure wasn't there. In fact, there was more of a tendency to want to amplify those while not talking about what happened to Amharas, which we felt was imbalanced also. And so overall, we also noted that the process was exclusionary. We noted the exclusion of representatives from the Gambela, Gurage, and Afar regions of Ethiopia. And as we know, these are communities that are also facing their own respective crises, which, we don't have the mandate to get into, but we said it would have been right if these representatives were also thought of and included in this process. And so it's also important here to highlight that this process wasn't something that was dictated by the diaspora representatives also. This was something where the US government officials, including the special envoy, had a very active process or had a very active role in managing the process. And so it's also important to note that the special envoy had made several remarks which we felt were not accurate concerning what's been happening in Ethiopia, especially from the Amhara lens. And one of these remarks was that the Amharas were the support base for Prime Minister Abiy before, at least maybe in the context of the war in northern Ethiopia. And that came as a surprise to us because for us as Amhara representatives, especially those of us who have been active on the social media space, who have been active in other areas and medias, it's been very clear. It's been something that we've made very clear that there's been a very real concern with Abiy, with the Prosperity Party, and that we did not feel that this was a party that represented Amharas. Even with the handling of the war, there was a problem. But in that meeting, I specifically raised issues or evidence such as the anti-government protests that have happened in Amhara region. This was something that came up in the public conference as well. How since April 2023, there was this latest wave of Amhara resistance, of demonstrations across more than 30 Amhara cities and towns. And this was also seen in some form in 2022, in 2021, in the form of the Bekan protests. And then earlier than that, in, for example, 2016, when we had this large Amhara resistance against the TPLF-dominated EPRDF. So the point that I made clear, and this was something that was actually contested by the rest of the room as well, was that the Amharas were actually stood out as the only region, or the people in the only region, that held consistent, widespread anti-government protests against the government. And this has been consistent between the EPRDF and the Prosperity Party. So Amharas were critical of both regimes. Okay. He remarked that the US was not interested in regime change and wanted to work with the government of Ethiopia to support a democratic, peaceful, and united Ethiopia. It's, again, this was an interesting remark. And then in the public event, it's also noteworthy that he said that Amharas were represented in the peace deal by their government, so the Pretoria Cessation of Hostilities. And this was something, again, that I myself, for example, repeatedly communicated that this was not a sentiment shared by the Amhara community. Amharas felt that they were excluded from the peace deal, that it was something where the Prosperity Party and the TPLF were negotiating, and that there was no party that could look after the interests of Amharas. Okay, and the Amhara representatives were actually forced to walk out. We were forced to walk out following a very triggering event in the private meeting, and that was when one of the diaspora representatives, amidst this back and forth that we were having with the special envoy, made a genocidal remark. This was a representative from the Oromo community, and this representative called for all Amharas to leave the Oromia region. So this was a very genocidal remark that was filled with hate speech, incitement of violence, and unfortunately, to our dismay, there was no reprimand or apology issued by the moderators or anybody else. So This was something that we communicated in that moment, and then following that that communication, there was no action taken, and then we were forced to walk out. So that was the the private event in a nutshell, and what led up to the Amhara representatives, including myself, walking out of that meeting. Okay, and for the public event, I had made a speech again that's available on the social media about what's been happening, the root causes, what needs to be done, and a lot of that messaging was very similar to what I discussed in the context of points raised in the private meeting. And a couple of things that I mentioned that maybe were not mentioned as much in the private meeting were the role of hate speech and scapegoating of Amharas through euphemisms like Amhara elites. This is a commonly seen phrasing that we see shared by actually many different commentators, analysts, so-called experts. And this is how there's hate directed towards Amharas in all types of narrative framing. And then how the Prosperity Party's Medemmer philosophy is actually a Trojan horse for their Oromo first policy, which is very ethnic. So they're under the cover of this thing that talks about unity, about economic development, about agricultural development, self-sufficiency, is actually something where you have a very ethnic-based an ethnic-based system that actually favors one group, the group of the ruling Oromo Prosperity Party, and is institutionalizing apartheid and genocide against other groups. And then lastly, the other representatives actually exploited that platform during the public event for propaganda. There was lots of victim blaming, atrocity denial, and to just give it a very brief example, one of the representatives from the diaspora community, especially particularly from the Oromo community, claimed that there was firstly no ethnic-based violence in the Oromia region, and then said that it was a very strange remark, by the way, that most people in this room that he was referring to, the auditorium, were in fact Oromos. So this is something that we've seen used before, and the pattern here is that this type of framing is then exploited to basically deny the ethnic nature of the atrocities and then say that there is no, for example, Amhara genocide. So it's very unfortunate that that happened, but that's the reality, and I think it's important that people are made aware of what was said by other groups as well, especially in this kind of a context where it's supposed to be about peace, but some groups feel the need to basically antagonize a whole ethnic group, in some ways actually enable the genocide and then defend the perpetrators of these atrocities.
Thank you, Robel, for providing an analysis for the proposed recommendation in the context of what took place during the private meeting. And I think it's important to highlight that in the so-called peace conference, genocidal comments from any individual or communities should not be tolerated, and people need to be held accountable for their comments. Going on to the third question, Robert, what are some of the key takeaways from the conference? And how do you assess the U.S. State Department policy toward Ethiopia, and specifically toward Amharas?
Thank you, Biniam. That's again a very important question, and I think it's worthwhile to kind of look at the timeline of what happened, because there's so much that happened in the past few years that it's very easy just to kind of gloss over all that's happened in this in the relationship between the international community actors and the Ethiopian government, the TPLF, and the other actors, and how there's been this framing that's kind of even changed over time. And so I think overall there's this feeling that the Biden administration and the State Department under Secretary Blinken have shown a pattern of selective concern for human rights when it comes to Ethiopia, and particularly a pattern of overlooking human rights violations against Amharas. Okay, and just to kind of frame this, we can talk about this Northern Ethiopia war, which started in November 2020. It happened in several waves, with the final wave being, or the third invasion of Amhara region being in August, late August of 2022, right? And so as that was happening, I think there was this interesting shift, because at the beginning, it wasn't the Biden administration that was in power. It was actually the Trump administration, and the State Department at that time, under Secretary of State Pompeo, had actually issued something that was more of maybe a balanced statement, because it actually implicated the TPLF in this military aggression that sparked the war, right? And then when the Biden administration took power or took office, there appeared to be a shift and a reframing. Okay, and so there was multiple statements. I invite the audience to kind of look at the history of AAA's communications in regards to various statements made by the Biden administration. However, just to fast forward, just in the best interest of time, for example, in the recent peace agreement, the recent peace agreement was actually signed in November 2nd of 2022, right? And before that, there was the announcement of the formation of the APND, the Amhara People's Negotiations Delegation. And that announcement happened on October 21st. And the reason for the formation of the APND was because the Amhara community already had an idea that these peace negotiations and dealings were underway, mediated by the African Union, mediated by international powers, supported by the United States government, and that Amharas were not represented in the framing that this was a war between the federal government or Prime Minister Abiy's government and the TPLF. We believe that was actually an oversimplification, that this agreement was basically, that when it was signed, was actually simplifying something that was more of a multilateral conflict into something that was bilateral. Okay, and following the cessation of hostilities agreement in November 2nd, on November 9th, the APND issued a statement basically communicating several points of opposition to the framing. And for example, there was talk of how the Prosperity Party could not represent Amharas because it didn't have mandate. Since May 2022, so of that year, there was more than 15,000 Amharas that were arrested in an initial mass detention campaign against any Amhara based on Amhara identity. Okay, and this is something that has continued. And we cited the anti-government protests communicating that the people on a wide scale opposed the Abiy regime. And so we also outlined fault lines in the peace deal, or the APND did, that there was no resolution to the issues of Walqait and Raya. There was no transitional justice for crimes perpetrated by the TPLF and even the Oromo Liberation Army during their occupation of large swaths of Amhara and Afar regions in the course of the war, and no groundwork for constitutional reform. Okay, so now fast forward, we earlier talked about the war on Amhara, the ethnic religious attacks, the intensified genocide, and all of these things. And in March 20th, basically there was a statement made by the State Department about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing in Ethiopia, which did implicate the major belligerents of war crimes, including the TPLF, including the ENDF, the EDF. But it seemed as though that there was an imbalanced determination here in which Amhara forces, among others, were disproportionately named relative to the TPLF, which had also committed some of the most egregious crimes. And we can take, for instance, the Mai Kadra massacre, which was the single largest civilian massacre of the war in northern Ethiopia. This was in November 2020. We had over 1,600 civilian Amharas systematically killed by these TPLF forces. And so when we talk about the implementation of this peace deal, following it, this government-sponsored ethnic and religious conflict came in many forms. And for example, there was an intensified genocide of Amharas in Western Oromia region, especially since November 2020. And this implicated not just the Oromo Liberation Army, the Oromia region special forces. Okay, the special forces are under the Oromia region government. And then at the federal level, you had complicity by the ENDF as well. And you had ethnic cleansing in Addis Ababa and Shagir, which I mentioned, that intensified in January 2023. The attack on the Orthodox Church, that intensified in February 2023. During that period, we saw, again, killing of worshippers, killing of civilians, unarmed civilians, particularly in the Oromia region and Addis Ababa, by government forces. And then demolitions of mosques. There was over 20 mosques that were demolished since May 2023 in the Shagir area and in Addis Ababa. And of course, the war in Amhara since May 2023. Okay, and so this, when you combine that with, for example, how the TPLF hasn't disarmed. I mentioned earlier about the ongoing occupation of areas in Alemt and Wag. Again, this is a fault line. And then ongoing, and that's a fault line. And then in late June 2023, the Biden administration lifted the human rights violation designation on Ethiopia, paving the way for more funding to the Abiy government. And so the Biden administration essentially deemed that there was no longer a pattern of gross violations of human rights. And this is despite the war in Amhara that began in May 2023, in which civilians were being massacred, raped, looted. The region was under de facto martial law. Telecommunication services were shut down, so the people were under blackout. And despite all of this happening, the State Department appeared to show no concern for human rights violations against the Amhara community. And then that brings us to July 2023, between the 21st and 22nd, during which this conference happened. And then, as we discussed earlier, we had concerns about exclusion of Amharas, its disorganized nature, and the sentiment that, you know, there wasn't really space for Amharas to communicate their grievances.
Thank you, Robel, for revealing some of the key takeaways from the conference. And I believe the U.S. State Department policy toward Ethiopia needs to change. The U.S. should stop supporting Abiy Ahmed, and they should support a civilian-led transitional government and a fundamental constitutional reform in Ethiopia to bring peace and stability in the Horn of Africa. Going on to the last question, Robel, do you have any last remaining remarks or statements you want to clarify?
Thank you, Biniam. I think I'd like to take this opportunity just to recognize the Amhara Association of San Diego and the Amhara Association in the LA area for their commitment and engagement in this entire ordeal. A lot of those people, they've been very active in their communities in the California area. They've been showing up to protest. They've been showing up to meetings with policymakers. There was an event with the special envoy, several weeks ago, in which he was hosted in LA by the Amhara community. And so, these are the people behind the scenes organizing at a local level, at a grassroots level. And I think we're seeing time and time again the value of having those organizations there. And I think slowly we're seeing the Amhara community become one of the largest, most organized, throughout the world on a global scale. And we're seeing that through many, many initiatives. Okay. And so I think it's important to highlight here how the Amhara Ethiopian diaspora in their various home countries, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Australia, how they support these democratic ideals and equity and all of these important issues, and how they hold oppressive regimes accountable for a lot of the things that are happening. And so that typifies or describes perfectly the Abiy regime and the regimes before him as well. And these are diaspora that are honest tax-paying citizens where they live, that make significant contributions to their communities on a local level. And so, their concerns should be heard by policymakers, but they need to also make those efforts to exercise their rights as citizens, okay, their civil liberties, which is, something that unfortunately Amharas in Ethiopia don't seem to have under this regime. And I think the inclusion of the Amhara representatives in this meeting was an outcome, a direct outcome of Amhara's organizing. Again, the importance of organizing, I can't emphasize it enough. And I think it's important for Amharas in the newer generations, the young people especially, to support these initiatives, to be part of these organizations, to be part of the next generation, to accept the torch and carry it forward, because that's a really important thing that we're going to have to do. We're going to have to figure out how to make this advocacy stuff intergenerational, because even if the war ends, even if, Amhara has come to a point where they're represented democratically, it's still going to be important to have those organizations intact for representation, for bringing communities together and allowing them to thrive, and to also to facilitate contributions to their host countries. And so we need people to lend their time, their talents, and their resources to support these initiatives. At AAA, we have the saying of Menkat, Madarajet, and Matagal. which roughly translates to awareness, organization, and struggle. And this captures the essence of Amhara advocacy, I believe, because now more than ever, the overarching goal of the Amhara movement is clear. Fundamentally, the Amhara people are facing this existential threat, not by one group, but by multiple groups. And so I can't stress enough that we have to organize. We have to make ourselves aware. We have to teach, young people what's going on. We have to teach our families, our friends, and we have to, have dialogues. We have to have discussions to ensure that we're on the same page. And if we can do that, we can make a lot happen. It's, for example, elections are coming up in the United States in 2024. So this is an opportunity for increasing political engagement. Amharas were one of the first, or if not the first, Ethiopian community to have a political action committee. It's called the Amhara PAC. And so this is a way to promote candidates who champion our issues, who are willing to carry on our issues. And so there's been work done on this, and this is something that we can develop further with the necessary support and resources. And so I'd encourage people to stay engaged with AAA, stay engaged with the conversation and current events on social media. It's not just AAA, but there's also vibrant conversations happening by a lot of young people, a lot of people actually from all generations that have come together on this digital space to talk about what's happening, to raise awareness, to organize, and to make a contribution that's positive, that's constructive towards the Amhara movement. And AAA can be reached across multiple platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, or I should say X, Telegram, TikTok, and YouTube. So people can support AAA financially by making regular monthly donations to support human rights advocacy and lobbying activities. And one of AAA's major activities is the human rights reporting. That's done with a team of human rights experts on the ground in Ethiopia. And so in order to pay their salaries, we need contributions from the community. And overall, I would say we've managed to make a lot happen. We're working towards accountability and justice for victims of Amhara genocide, not just to end it, but to hold the perpetrators accountable. And in my public speech, I named them. I named the individuals who we hold accountable, all the way from the likes of Abiy Ahmed, the Shimon Lesabdisa, to Burhanu Jula, to Getachew Redda, Debretsion Gebre Mikael, Taddessa Warada, Tzadkan Gebre Tensai, to the likes of Kumsa Deriba, to the likes of Jawar Mohammed, and then even the so-called Amhara region representatives, people like Yilik Al-Kafala, people like Agengo Tishagar, and then even the likes of Ababa Taddessa. So, there's no selective nature here. We're holding all perpetrators of these atrocities against the Amhara people accountable. And if we can make that happen, we can, promote, basically, we can end this cycle of impunity and promote the human rights of our people, which must be valued because all human life is important. We have to cherish it. We have to hold it sacred. And Amhara lives matter. So we need to stand up for the lives of our people. There's no shame in that. These people are being targeted for their ethnic identity. We can't hide that. We have to call it by what it is. It's a genocide. It's a genocide against these people, but it will end in the future if we come together and we work to stop it. Thank you, Biniam.
Thank you again, Robel. I also want to thank the Amhara Association of San Diego and the Amhara Association of Los Angeles for lobbying and advocating for Amharas to be represented in this Ethiopian Diaspora Peace Conference. And the fact that the Amhara representatives walked out of the private meeting sends a strong message that Amharas have a demand of their own. And if those demands are not respected, we will not be taken for granted. And lastly, I want to thank you, Robel. You are an exemplary leader, and I believe your speech at the Peace Conference, which was shared on Twitter, captures your youthful exuberance and your immense and unwavering contribution to the Amhara struggle. So thanks again for joining us, Robel.
Thank you, Biniam.
Absolutely. And thank you to our Maghrib Media family members for watching. And until we meet again, take care.